called to the stand a Escobar, otro indio encomendado a Solís. Y este Taino fue muy interesante because he didn't have just one interpreter. He had two. He is called un indio Navoría de Solís, y estando presentes los intérpretes Luis de Sanabria, criado de Francisco de Barraza, y Alonso Delgado, criado del bachiller Juan de Becerra. One of the reasons I could find for having two interpreters is that whatever language he spoke, it wasn't one of the main languages of the island. It could also be that he wasn't originally a Taino. He could have been someone that was brought from one of the other islands or even the mainland, because by this time there were expeditions going to Mexico, what today is Mexico y Guatemala. So whatever the setup was, he needed these two interpreters. But unfortunately, we don't have his full statement, because the statement that is in the current documents just says that he agrees with what he originally said. So his original statement is not available. We do know is that on the 27th of October, it seems like the judge went back and questioned everybody again. And I'm pretty sure that he was looking to see if the natives' statements were consistent, because he was having a hard time with the Spanish witnesses. So after the judge hears everybody's statements and confirms everything everyone says, he turns his attention back to Marcos Pérez de Cáceres and Gonzalo de Niebla. He decides to have them tortured. This was the usual technique among the Spanish when they felt that someone was lying. So he had them tortured in la forma acostumbrada. They state the following. This was also used on the natives as well. Para saber la verdad de este hecho que le requería y requirió que le dijese la verdad con presentación que le hizo, que si por no la decir en el tormento muriere, o perdieren algún miembro, que sea a su culpa y no a la suya. In other words, if during the torture he would die or lose a limb, whatever, it was his fault, not the judge's. The judge/prosecutor mandó a desnudar al dicho Gonzalo de Niebla, y fue desnudado, y le mandó atar los brazos. This torture, Gonzalo de Niebla then changes his story again and says that in reality, he was called to the jail by one of Solis's servants, and that Solis then told him, hey, you remember what happened to this native? Well, I need you to go to the court and say that you hit him. But Solis did not tell him that the trial was for a murder case. He had no idea that he was incriminating himself, and that it was Cáceres who threatened him, saying que dijese su dicho, diciéndole que no se fuese hasta decir su dicho, sino que irían por él a su costa. In other words, if he didn't give testimony, they would hunt him down. Y que ese testigo en aquel temor no se fue y esperó a decir su dicho. So he went and gave a statement because he was scared. The judge wanted to make sure that Gonzalo de Niebla understood what he was saying. So he had his first statement and his second statement read to him. And Gonzalo de Niebla says, que es la mayor mentira del mundo, que el diablo se le revistió en las tripas y se lo hizo decir, y que la verdad es lo que dijo es su segundo dicho. The judge became satisfied with Gonzalo de Niebla's testimony and probably took pity on him. He had gotten very, very sick in jail, y nos dice el documento that era hombre lisiado y flaco y mal dispuesto. So he had him untied. Then it was Marcos Pérez de Cáceres' turn to be tortured. He then decided to tell the truth. And he just said the same thing that he said in his first statement about who did what. So the judge was not happy. He ordered for Cáceres to be tied to a stake, had a piece of rag put into his mouth, and then they poured an entire pitcher of water onto the rag. Cáceres was tortured on and off throughout the entire day until the judge got sick of it and sent him back to the jail where Gonzalo de Niebla already was. On October 29th, Cáceres wrote a letter to the judge stating that he had legal rights and that he wasn't saying what he was saying just to get out of the situation. But in order to exercise his right, he needed to let the judge know that he was hijos d'algo. He was trying to say that he was son of a nobleman or somewhere along the lines of that. He wanted permission from the judge to bring in other witnesses that could prove his lineage and also his legal status and his rights. And his letter had effect. The judge prosecutor allowed him more time to gather the witnesses he needed in order to prove his defense. With Cáceres on the back burner, the judge turned his attention back to the sickly Gonzalo de Niebla. He was now suffering from syphilis. How? Probably had it from before he went to jail, but he was punished for the mess he caused in his trial. And he was ordered to be put on a donkey, tied up, completely in the nude, and taken through the public streets of Santiago, where the people in the town were going to humiliate him, on top of being given 100 lashes, while also having something in his mouth to prevent him from screaming. On the 30th of October, his sentence was carried out, and he was dragged through the streets, and he was also beaten by a native who was ordered to do so. I found it strange that I couldn't find the punishment for Cáceres, but I was able to find out what happened to him through another witness. The trial is delayed for whatever reason, it's not stated in the document. But on January 18th, 1510, the trial continues with the statement of Francisco de Burgos, el chocarrero. He is the jester in this trial, also known as a fool. His job was to make people laugh and kind of make things happier within the circumstances. He is a type of buffoon who would go from estate to estate haciendo chocarrerías, which is just foolish nonsense, again, to make people laugh. In exchange, he was giving food, clothing, a place to stay. At the moment that these events happened, he was living in la hacienda de la Esperanza with Solis. He was brought to testify before the judge and asked what he knew about what happened to Francisquito. This witness adds that the way that Francisquito was tied, he was tied with his hands up, but the actual rope was tied to el bohío. But that he wasn't sure of details. He doesn't know who hit him. He doesn't know how he died or when he died. But he did say that Francisquito was very skinny. But then he says, oh yeah, you know what? Solis did whip him a couple of times. And while he was whipping him, he would say, ajura higuerico, y el dicho indio le respondía diciendo, ajura señor. And then he was let go, he was untied, he was sent to the kitchen, and here he adds something different. He says that the native said that he needed to take some herbs. And it was after taking these herbs that el Taino began to complain. Que el dicho indio comenzó a dar gritos y este testigo, el chocarrero, se levantó y halló al indio en el suelo tendido, revolcándose, que estaba hipando, como si se le saliese el alma, diciendo que le dolía la barriga. Y este testigo y otros mozos le dieron a beber aceite porque echaba espumarajos, creyendo que sanaría y que luego aquella noche murió. He says that he saw when his body was taken out of the bohío, but he doesn't know where he was buried. And that's the end of his testimony. On the 2nd of May, 1510, Gonzalo de Villegas, Solis's best friend, decides to send his own statement to the judge. He uses the 5 original questions that were given to the other 2 witnesses, Juan Barra and Pero the Barbero. To question number 1, he says that he knew Francisco de Solis. In question number 2, we get a little bit more information about what happened to both Guayabax and Francisquito, because Villegas says that Francisco de Solis was actually living in his house for some reason, and that he was there when he had seen Solis order Gaspar to assault Guayabax, and that he was beaten while he was naked, but that the beating was templado, as always. In the second question, Villegas reveals that this exchange between different encomenderos switching and borrowing the natives who were quote unquote under their care was very extensive, because he says that Guayabax not only worked with him, but also with another encomendero called Juan Barba, who was one of the other witnesses for Solis, and that he also was using Antonico and another indigenous boy named Jorgico, and otros dos que el dicho Solís se los dio para que trabajasen en su conuco, hasta que hubiesen de regresar a las minas. Because remember, they were supposed to be resting. They weren't supposed to be worked like this. But the Spanish settlers didn't care. They wanted to live the high life. They wanted workers for everything. They themselves were supposed to be working, but they didn't do it. They were using the natives to work instead. It does say that Solis made him, Villegas, beat Guayabax for whatever reason. It doesn't state here in his statement, but he does say that Guayabax anduvo bueno y sano y trabajaba mejor que ninguno de los otros indios. So Guayabax was praised and valued by the Spanish settlers, but even so, he wasn't treated right. And that's why he repeatedly ran away. In his answer to the fourth question, Villegas gives us a glimpse into how diseases and ailments were treated by the indigenous people on the island. Because he says that Guayabax supposedly got ill at his house in su conuco. He had fevers, and that every night, instead of staying at his house, he would go back to Solis's hacienda. And because he got so sick, Solis lo hizo sangrar a un Pero Sánchez, which was el barbero de Santiago, y le hizo curar y hacer todos los beneficios que pudo, y porque ensordeció. So he says that Guayabex lost his hearing because of the fevers and the sickness. De aquella dolencia le hizo venir a maestro Juan Cirujano. So he even got the local surgeon to come and take a look at Guayabax, que le curase. Él le hizo hacer unos embrazos de hierba. So it's kind of like paste of herbs. Hierba buena con ciertas cosas para ponerle en las sienes. So here. Que desde a 15 o 20 días que le dieron las dichas calenturas, murió de ellas. To the fifth question, Villegas has an interesting answer, because he says that Francisquito, while being brought by Cristóbal Valdovinos from El Marián, de Casa de Carvanera, who was el cacique que está cerca de Puerto Real, that Francisquito se le echaba por el camino. In other words, he would fall to the ground y se revolcaba por el suelo y que echaba espumarajos que parecía que le tomaba el diablo. We see this phrase, tomaba el diablo, several times. And it's only now that it's clear that this tomaba el diablo didn't mean possession. It meant that he was, it seems like, having a epileptic attack. Y que un Francisco criado de Juan Gutiérrez de la Cava que lo ayudó a levantar. Solis is getting very aggravated with the delay of the trial. He has been in house arrest since October of 1509. We are now in May of 1510, and on May 4th, he decides to get a new lawyer. He hires Juan Garcia, Procurador Especial, and then he sends another letter through this new lawyer on May 7th, 1510, to the judge. In this letter, his new defense is to invalidate and discredit the natives and the people, the other people, the Spanish, who testified against him. He then blasts the indigenous people who were testifying, mentioning Cantalina, Mencia, Miguelico, everybody, saying that their testimonies don't go with each other. They all contradict each other. They're not mentioning the same things. They're saying that I hit him with this and I hit him with that. The indigenous people are mostly slaves. And in particular, the indigenous women, he says, ellas son esclavas y mujeres. No jura decir porque no tienen conciencia, ni temen a Dios, ni cumplen sus mandamientos, ni saben qué daño resulta de jurar falso y no decir verdad. In conclusion, he says that everybody's testimony should be thrown out of court. Solis's lawyer asked the judge for more time to question new witnesses in Solis's defense. His request is granted, and he designs 11 questions to ask his witnesses. And I'm not going to go through all of these witnesses because they don't really have anything to do with the murder case. I will, though, go over some of their testimonies that share some insights into native lives and their relationship with the Spanish. So, of the 11 questions, we only have 2 that we are concerned about. Question number 8 that says, si saben y creen que todos los indios generalmente son hombres de poca conciencia, que no temen a Dios ni cumplen sus mandamientos, ni saben qué daño se recrece de jurar falso y no decir verdad, a sus conciencias testimoniaron de sí mismos y mecidos agoreros no cristianos cualquier mal a la gente de Castilla, porque le hacen servir en sus haciendas y por poco que le castiguen toman enemistad y otras muchas tachas, los cuales testigos declaren que tantas y cuantas saben aquellos y en poco temor y dádiva dicen lo que es y lo que no es, por tales son ávidos y tenidos comúnmente reputados. This again is the same strategy. He's trying to discredit all of this testimony. Miguel de la Casa, another witness for Solis, has a pretty lengthy response, but in essence he says que tiene los indios por hombres de poca conciencia y que ni temen a Dios ni saben qué cosa es, ni en qué se perjuran o dañan sus conciencias. Preguntado por qué los tiene por tales, dijo que porque algunas veces ha oído decir a indios que creen en semis. In other words, they were still keeping their religion. They were not accepting the Catholic faith. Y que no quieren ser cristianos ni saben qué son los mandamientos. Y que este testigo no cree nada de ellos. Pero Hernández adds something interesting as well to the 8th question, and he says que cree todo lo que en la dicha pregunta se contiene. Preguntado por qué, so they asked him, why do you believe this? Dijo que porque algunas veces en casa del comandador mayor, who was Ovando, ha habido Alonso de Cáceres. Alonso de Cáceres was his, we can say butler, his indigenous butler, indio, que es lengua bien entendido estar borracho con hierbas, smoking tobacco, y otros muchos indios decir mentiras, y que claro está que quieren mal a los cristianos y que los querrían ver muertos, porque los castigan y apremian, lo cual es así público y notorio en esta isla. So they're finding it strange that the indigenous people dislike them when they're being punished by them. Where is their mind? Pedro Benitez then adds to this, and he says that he believes the question, and when asked why, he says, lo tiene así, dijo, que allende de muchas cosas que de ellos ha visto y ha sido en Jaragua. Fue una india casada a decir al comandador mayor, Ovando. So they're talking about Ovando's time. Mind you, Ovando has been gone for a couple of months. Que su marido se echaba con otra su hermana y que la hermana lo fue a decir y dijo que se había echado el marido de su hermana con ella y que el comandador mayor se informó de la verdad y halló que era mentira, que lo habían hecho porque les habían dicho que quien dormía con 2 hermanas lo habían de quemar. Y que sabe que quieren mal a los cristianos y porque este testigo lo ha visto decir a muchos indios que son bellacos los cristianos. So here we're seeing a bit of the indigenous side. So the Spanish were seeing the indigenous people as rebellious, But then the indigenous people were seeing the Christians as rebellious or bellacos, at least according to this witness. We have to realize that the indigenous people had different customs, and it was normal for them to have sexual relations with different people. It wasn't a taboo thing to do. But for the settlers, for the Spanish, this was a big deal. The story, though, says that it was an indigenous woman who wanted to punish her sister for being with her man. However, this doesn't seem correct. It seems like this was mostly made up. Or it could have been that she was jealous and she wanted to use the Spanish and their policies to go after her man. Could be. I mean, this still happens nowadays. The ninth question is the second question we want to look at in this list of 11 questions. Because all the other questions are just about defending Solis and discrediting the Spanish witnesses. But these two particular questions are about the Tainos. So question number 9 says, Si saben Mencia, Tebanico, Escobar, Catalina, Miguelico, Naborías del dicho Francisco de Solís ser indios e indias, especialmente Mencia, y Allende de ser india es esclava de Gonzalo de Villegas, the best friend, personas que siendo indias caben en ellas las sobredichas tachas de los indios y tales de presumir y creer. This question rides on the previous question, question number 8. Talking about the indigenous people's character and beliefs. This question number 9 is saying, did your answer for question number 8 also apply to the witnesses in this trial? Villegas responds about his own slave the following: que aunque les haga mucho bien, si no están contentos, luego se quejan. Por tales, este testigo los tiene. Y si les mandan muchas veces el propósito que tiene, que esto es notorio. Juan de Aguirre said, I already answered that question. Rodrigo Manzorro says the same thing. My answer to number 8 applies to them. Juan Carrillo Mejia, who was the original prosecutor in the case and also best friends with Solis, says he can't apply his answer to number 8 to them or to any of the other ones because he doesn't know them. Pero Hernández, el herrero, and he says in the answer to number 9, no conoce las dichas indias, pero que bien cree que las dichas tachas o stories caben en ellos, y por lo que dicho tiene y por otras muchas cosas que les ha visto hacer a los indios en esta isla. So I don't know them, but I would apply what was said to them. Pedro Benitez says, you know what? I was the one who told the story about the native woman trying to get her husband burned. So, a la novena pregunta dijo lo que tiene dicho y lo cree de todos los indios. Alonso Gutierrez, to question number 8, said, yes, that's totally true. They are horrible people. And that's why their testimony should not be included. Alonso Gutierrez, in his answer to number 9, he says that he doesn't know them, so he can't say anything about them. The judge rests his case after all of these testimonies and all of these witnesses. But by May 27, 1510, Solis is getting very restless. He hasn't heard anything. So he sends a letter to the judge again. And in this letter, he tells the judge, just admit that you couldn't find me guilty and let me out. I need a response. I do not know why you're taking so long. I already told you that these people are all lying. You couldn't prove your case. So give me a verdict. And he was found guilty. The judge ruled on the 14th of August. And so he took his sweet time. From May to August is how many months? This is June, July, August. 3 months to make this decision. And he made it without Solis or his lawyers present. He was told as part of his punishment that he was banished from La Villa de Santiago. He also could not return to Santiago without the express permission of the judge/prosecutor, el alguacil mayor Marcos de Aguilar. He's given another fine of gold And then Solis is informed of the decision on the 17th of May, 1510. Solis is furious and he goes on to appeal the decision on August 21st, and he sends his lawyer back with an appeal letter to the judge. The judge says to come back in a couple of days for a decision. Again, this judge is not interested in giving him a decision, so he denies his appeal, stating that the defendant didn't suffer any harm from the sentence. But on January 17th, 1511, Solis presented himself in person to the judge once again and asked to have his appeal granted. Aguilar informed him that he had to go to Spain in order to be granted the type of appeal that he wanted, and that he had permission to leave on the next ship out. We don't have the appeal documents, but it seems like the Spanish Supreme Court upheld the decision because we have a Francisco de Solís durante el repartimiento de 1514, but in Santo Domingo and not in Santiago. So what were some of the implications of the trial? The trial made it very clear that the Spanish did view the natives as people, but they viewed them as inferior forms. They were intellectually deficient and they were prone to lying. And we also get to see more of the natives' perspective, especially with Sebastianico's statement that Francisco de Solís era un loco. They were unafraid to express themselves and say what was actually going on. Because all of this, all of them were still under the encomenderos' control. But they still went and testified against Solís. This trial also showed how the indigenous people held on with all their might to their religious and cultural practices. We see that in one of the testimonies from the witnesses. He is upset, and this was Miguel de la Casa. He was very upset about the fact that the indigenous people continue to use their semis and continue to use herbs, which were all part of their original culture. So there was a clear refusal to accept the religious invasion. There were some natives that were raised with the Spanish and refused to do La Ave Maria. We know some other cases, even years later, where this was still happening. But they were still willing to use like different technology. We see several times references that a shovel was used to supposedly bury one of the either Guayabax or Francisquito. And we know that this was deeply concerning, their lack of apego a la religión católica. We have a letter from Diego Colón while on the island on the 6th of June, 1511. And he told the king that los indios de la Española, que no tienen más de cristiano sino el nombre, salvo los muchachos que crían los frailes en los conventos, que aquellos dicen que los hacen bien. And we also see how the Taino burial practices affected the Spanish. When King Ferdinand heard about, we can assume this particular case, but probably other cases where indigenous people would leave bodies out into La Savanna to rot, the king was very distraught by this. He did not like this. And he ordered for the use of books or registries to mark the birth and death of the natives because it pained him, as he himself wrote, que los entierren en el campo como a infieles. It could also be that this case brought a precedent that scared the Spanish. Because we know of another case from 1525 of a licenciado Altamirano, who was the governor of Fernandina, now known as Cuba, who was brought to account in Spain. But one of the things that was asked was the following. Se le hace cargo que estando proveído y no usado en estas partes que ningún indio se le tome juramento en ningunas causas por ser los tales indios incapaces y no saber qué cosa es juramento ni en qué consiste el odio, se les tomó juramento a indios bozales contra un Antonio de Valladolid. It made it clear that they wanted to prohibit the use of indigenous people in trial. Their reasoning was that the indigenous people didn't have a concept of vowing or of taking oath, and that they didn't have the capacity to know when they were being truthful or not. However, this didn't stop the indigenous people from using the court system when they needed to. We have so many different cases of indigenous people who fought through the court systems to get back their freedom and to get back home. We have cases from Mexico, Peru, Cuba, Borinquen y el Boye, o Santo Domingo.